Hello, this is Mikelle Herron, Dana Manheim, and Holly Moran presenting our case study presentation for Introduction to Environmental Health. For the first part of this presentation, we will discuss the Toms River story.
To provide context for the remainder of our presentation, we thought it would be helpful to provide a brief recap of the contamination that occurred on the Superfund site in Toms River. In 1953, a dye factory called Ciba opened a $17 million factory on a 1,350-acre property off of Route 37 in Toms River. In 1965, the company started dumping polluted dye waste into Toms River Water Company's Hollywell Field, the town's main water supply at the time. In 1971, dumping continued in Route 9 Farm, Reich property, in Toms River, Pleasant Plains. They continued to store industrial waste in this farm, which was located just a mile north of Toms River. In 1974, chemical pollutants, a few of which will be discussed later in this presentation, were found in Reich Farm, totaling 146 private wells that were ordered to be sealed due to contamination. In 1982, Ciba is listed as a Superfund site after a thorough investigation conducted by the EPA, which found cancer-causing chemicals on the property. Not until 1996, groundwater treatment systems began operating on Ciba's property. In March of 1996, state health departments reported that rates of childhood brain and central nervous system cancers in Toms River were 3 times higher than expected. Given this information, there are 2 particularly vulnerable groups within Toms River contamination. The first includes the residents that lived within a few mile radius of any of the 8 major wells in the United Water Toms River Parkway supply. This is because these residents used United Water as their primary source for water, and as a result, experienced chronic contamination exposure. Even more of a vulnerable population included children. According to the state and federal studies that were conducted, 90 children were diagnosed with cancers in Toms River. According to a study conducted by Chance in 2001, children are more susceptible to contaminants than adults, making them an extremely vulnerable population. This is because children drink more water per body pound of weight, and their bodies are still growing, and toxic chemicals cause more harm to developing organs and tissues. 2 chemicals present in the Toms River contamination were benzene and trichloroethene. According to Freese 2019, these solvents are released from industrial facilities that may release these vapors from solvents into surrounding neighborhoods where residents can inhale them chronically. Freese 2019 also mentions that they may enter the soil or groundwater due to improper disposal or when they leach out of waste sites. Benzene is a colorless liquid that is used to manufacture resins, plastics, and synthetic fibers. Trichloroethene is a synthetic, non-flammable chemical that evaporates easily and is used in many industries as a metal degreaser. According to the HSCI, the possible sources of exposure to benzene are most likely through the contamination of drinking water from Toms River due to the leakage of hazardous materials from the Ciba Corporation. Residents of Toms River can be exposed to contaminated water through ingestion and from working with foods prepared with water from these contaminated sites, and from showering, bathing, swimming in the contaminated water. In regards to modes of entry, benzene can enter the body through the lungs, GI tract, and across the skin. When an individual is exposed to benzene in the air, about half of what you breathe enters your bloodstream. Inhalation of benzene during cooking can also occur and is heightened by poor ventilation in homes. When an individual eats or drinks contaminated food or water, most benzene that is taken in through the mouth or the lining of the GI enters the bloodstream. Benzene can also pass through your skin and into your bloodstream. Once benzene is in the bloodstream, it is converted into products called metabolites and then enter the liver and the bone marrow. According to the HSCI, sources of exposure to trichloroethylene include eating, drinking, or handling contaminated water, or inhaling contaminated air from burning coal or fossil fuels. Similar to benzene, modes of entry include inhalation of the compound in ambient air and ingestion of drinking water. Interestingly, dermal exposure is not considered a severe point of exposure to trichloroethylene to enter the body. Aside from the aforementioned central nervous system and brain cancers that resulted from the Toms River contamination, There are other health effects that result from benzene and trichloroethylene. Two health effects from benzene include potential birth defects and cancer in blood-forming organs. Two major health effects of trichloroethylene differ based on acute versus chronic exposure, but can include liver damage from chronic exposure and cardiovascular effects, including cardiac arrhythmias or other cardiac sensations. Given the time period, fewer environmental regulations, and initial excitement for SIBA to enter the community, it would have been fairly difficult to prevent the outcomes from occurring in Toms River. However, there are a few potential prevention efforts that could have occurred from different entities involved in the incident. SIBA could have enacted a more forward-thinking, developed plan for chemical disposals and done more preliminary research to prevent this from occurring. Though it would have been more costly up front, it would have saved the company more money downstream to enact preventative cleanup efforts in the short term. Wells at the farms could have also enacted some sort of chemical test to ensure the water people were ingesting was not contaminated. Even though the technology and legal standards during the time are not at the level they are today, this technology was still available. Though the residents of Toms River played an integral part in holding SIBA accountable down the road, one potential source of prevention could have been reporting symptoms earlier, immediately once they were detected. Finally, though this is a lofty potential prevention effort, the state and federal legislature could have enacted stricter corporate policy and environmental regulations and standards. As a result of the contamination, SIBA spent over $300 million to clean up the toxic waste, and a 5-year epidemiological study costing $10 million was designed to explain why Toms River experienced such high rates of childhood cancer. According to Staccato in 2001, these results could have been potentially avoided. One thing is for sure, the Toms River reconstruction of the township's water systems, developed by Toxic Substances Disease Registry, is considered a definitive benchmark of future historical reconstruction modeling around the world.
Let's summarize this case study by looking at the pros and cons of the company's and government's actions. It certainly was a pro that Ciba-Geigy provided economic stability to the town of Toms River by providing jobs to its residents. However, the company purposely moved to Toms River knowing that it was an isolated town so they could get away with their illegal activities. Throughout this case, Ciba-Geigy disposed solid and liquid waste from the manufacturing processes in about 20 areas on the site's property, causing soil and groundwater contamination. Direct discharge of wastewater into Toms River occurred from 1952 to 1966, and then they proceeded to discharge wastewater into the Atlantic Ocean through a 10-mile-long underground pipeline. There were pipeline breaks in 1984, 88, and 89 that resulted in additional areas of off-site contamination. In the late 70s, the state of New Jersey issued permits to close 2 disposal areas on the site, which required Ciba-Geigy to start cleanup actions, which was a pro. All commercial operations were seized in 1996, but Ciba-Geigy agreed to continue cleanup activities through the early 2000s. In 2001, they agreed to a cash settlement with 69 families in Toms River related to studies on childhood cancer. Even though they agreed to the settlement, none of the companies involved in this case acknowledged responsibility for the cancer cases. The other major offender in the Toms River case was Union Carbide Corporation. In 1971, over 4,500 drums of chemical waste were illegally dumped at Wright Farm, which led to further groundwater contamination. Most of these drums were marked with Union Carbide logos. The company took several actions to correct this, including removal of the drums and contaminated soil from the site shortly after the incidents. They also signed a consent order with the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection to do additional investigations. They paid to install treatment systems and, along with Ciba-Geigy, agreed to a cash settlement with the families who are affected by the contamination. Like Ciba-Geigy, they did not acknowledge responsibility for the cancer cases. The government was quite involved in the Toms River case. As mentioned on the previous slide, the state of New Jersey issued permits to close disposal site areas on the site. 2 years later, in 1980, the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection mandated that Ciba-Geigy remove 15,000 drums and initiate groundwater monitoring. The site was placed on the Superfund National Priorities List in 1983, making it a top site of concern for the EPA. The EPA began remedial investigation in 1984, and finally, in 1996, the New Jersey Department of Health and Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry developed a public health response plan to investigate childhood cancer in Toms River. It was a con that the government was not aware of Ciba-Geigy's illegal activities for decades. During that time, the environmental laws were not as strict as they are today, allowing these companies to get away with more. Unfortunately, the EPA was not created until 1970. Ciba-Geigy was already carrying out illegal activities since 1952. For the second part of this presentation, we chose the Hinckley, California water contamination story.
Pacific Gas and Electric Company services the residents in the Mojave Desert town of Hinckley, California. Located approximately 2 miles from the town of Hinckley, PG&E has been cited as the source of one of the most widely known environmental contamination occurrences in U.S. history. From 1952 to 1966, PG&E used a chemical, chromium-6, also known as hexavalent chromium, to combat rust and corrosion in cooling tower water. While this practice in itself wasn't the source of contamination, PG&E discharged the chromium-6 contaminated water into unlined ponds. Without properly lined ponds, the contaminated wastewater eventually seeped into Hinckley's groundwater. Hinckley's groundwater reserve served as the town's main source of drinking water. Chromium-6 contaminated water left Hinckley's residents vulnerable to serious disease and illness. Among the most susceptible populations were children, immunocompromised individuals such as the elderly, and pregnant women. Those drawing water nearest to the chromium-6 plume, which was 8 miles long and 2 miles wide, were at the greatest risk for adverse health effects. The main contaminant in the Hinckley water supply, which was discharged by PG&E, was chromium-6. Chromium-6, or hexavalent chromium, is not naturally occurring, but rather altered in the industrial process. Chromium-3 is naturally occurring and is not considered toxic in this form. The chromium-6 was introduced into the groundwater supply in Hinckley through the seepage of contaminated wastewater from PG&E. Since this is the only pollutant officially traced back to PG&E's industrial processes in the 1960s, we decided to look into other chemicals that have been more recently found in Hinckley's water supply. More recently, as of 2018, Hinckley's groundwater supply has been shown to contain high levels of arsenic. Arsenic is a crystalline metalloid that is naturally occurring in rocks. It's also a chemical that has been used as a pesticide and to preserve wood. A geologic study from 2015 to 2017 found arsenic readings from several wells in Hinckley to contain more than 50 times the state drinking water limit of 10 parts per billion of arsenic. The report has yet to be publicized, and therefore the source of the arsenic has yet to be named, but is not thought to be traced back to PG&E's operations. The sources of exposure for chromium-6 in the town of Hinckley could have been from inhalation of chromium-6, dermal contact, or most likely ingestion of the chemical. Contamination of the water supply in Hinckley provided many sources of potential exposure for residents. Using the chromium-6 contaminated water to bathe, cook, drink, or swim in provided many opportunities for the residents to be exposed to chromium-6 in high quantities. Today in Hinckley, arsenic exposure to residents is occurring through the ingestion of their contaminated water supply. The source of the arsenic has yet to be officially named, and therefore the potential for exposure of residents is publicly unknown. The major health effects of chromium-6 exposure include cancer and respiratory effects. Specifically, cancers of the lungs, nasal, and sinus cavities have been associated with chromium-6 exposure. The mechanism of toxicity is thought to damage cellular components including DNA. The EPA has set water quality standards that chromium-6 should be at levels below 100 parts per billion in the water supply for safe consumption. The California Water Board has set and enforced even stricter standards. In addition, chromium-6 can irritate the respiratory tract and cause a number of adverse health effects ranging from asthma to ulceration of the upper respiratory tract. The EPA and WHO have both classified chromium-6 as a known human carcinogen. Arsenic exposure affects nearly all internal organ systems when ingested. Contact exposure to arsenic can cause dermal lesions and skin cancer. Gastrointestinal effects of arsenic ingestion are generally acute in nature. Inflammation, lesions, and gastroenteritis are noted. More chronic GI effects include elevated liver enzymes and hepatic cancer. Pigment changes in the skin can occur from contact exposure to arsenic. Chronic exposure can lead to skin lesions and cancer. Actions by the PG&E Company in Hinckley, California could have prevented the fate of the town's water supply. With proper planning, the contaminated wastewater could have been properly treated or contained within lined ponds. This would have prevented the chromium-6 from ever being introduced into the groundwater supply through leaching. In addition, the California Water Board could have taken a more proactive approach to testing and understanding the chemicals present in their water supply. It wasn't until PG&E informed the Water Board of the contamination in 1987 that they took any action to inform the public and remediate. This seems to remain a problem today with the current levels of arsenic found in the local water supply. The residents of Hinckley could have also been proactive about their health and reported symptoms and demanded answers. However, with so many various symptoms and no hints to the source of the problem, it's an unlikely prevention effort. The responsibility of California and federal legislature could have been involved earlier and more intimately with the contamination in Hinckley. California did pass a law for the regulation of chromium-6 in 1977, however, it wasn't monitored in Hinckley and only came to light 10 years later.
Let's take a look at PG&E's actions taken throughout the history of this case. Looking at cons, from 1952 to 1965, PG&E knowingly used chromium-6 in their cooling towers to inhibit corrosion. And for even longer, until 1972, wastewater was being discharged into unlined ponds, allowing it to leach into groundwater. It was a pro that in 1987, officials from PG&E informed California authorities that they detected high levels of chromium-6 that were 10 times the state's limit in a groundwater monitoring well. However, it took a long time for the company to come forward about this. They knew about the contamination at least since 1965 and did nothing. After a lawsuit was filed by the residents of Hinckley in 1993, PG&E denied that the residents' injuries were due to contamination and filed a motion to strike all claims relating to this. But finally, in 1996, the company agreed to settle with the plaintiffs for $333 million and agreed to clean up the contamination. As of 2013, PG&E had spent over $750 million on remediation. Now let's take a look at how the government was involved. Recognizing the potential damaging health effects of chromium-6 exposure, the state of California passed a law in 1977 which limited the concentration of chromium-6 to 50 micrograms per liter of water. After PG&E came forward about the high levels of chromium-6 in the groundwater monitoring well, the California Water Board issued a cleanup and abatement order, requiring a site investigation and cleanup activities. They amended this order twice, which required even further actions by PG&E. A potential con by the government is, did the California authorities properly inform the residents of Hinckley about the chromium-6 contamination when they came forward about this? Or did this not happen until later? During the research on this case study, nothing was found about action taken by the government on the federal level. How involved was the EPA? Nothing was found about this site being on the EPA's national priorities list, which is a list of the EPA's most serious hazardous sites in the U.S. If the EPA were more involved, action may have been taken more quickly. A major advocacy movement took place in the town of Hinckley. Aaron Brockovich, an employee of a California law firm, was integral in this movement. After being hired at the firm, Brockovich found records of PG&E's offers to buy Hinckley citizens' properties. When she saw that these documents were mixed with residents' medical records, this got her attention. She started a personal investigation of PG&E's illegal activities in Hinckley and was able to convince residents who were injured by the contamination to file a lawsuit against PG&E. Originally in 1993, there were 77 plaintiffs. This grew to 648 plaintiffs, and as mentioned previously, they settled for $333 million. Brockovich's story is the subject of the 2000 movie Erin Brockovich, starring Julia Roberts. Unfortunately today, the town of Hinckley remains contaminated and is considered a ghost town. These are our references used for this presentation. Here our references continue. Thank you so much for watching.